God knows what I need to do in my generation, just like they need to do it in their generation. So we have girls coming up behind us that are better communicators than we ever were. They know the word better. And I could either be intimidated or I could be insecure, or I can say they need to be prepared for their generation.
Yes.
Hi, welcome back to Havilah's podcast. I'm Havilah, and you are joining us on our series of Women in Leadership. I'm so glad that you're here. I think this is an important topic because a lot of times it feels like we either really talk about it and kind of fight about it and get really intense about it, or we don't talk about it at all and we hope nobody asks. And so I'm hoping that we can have a really healthy conversation around this topic. Of course, we're not able to hit everything in detail. We get that. We're not naive to the fact that these are real questions. And I don't think that, you know, if you're sitting on one side or the other, that that's somehow ignorance. I think it's been a confusing conversation in the church. And so I'm really hoping to unpack some of these, maybe give you some freedom as a woman leader to understand how I process stuff. And I couldn't think of anybody better than Caitlin Zick to join me on the podcast because you as well are a senior pastor with your husband at a church in town. And so you and I have been leading as pastors for a long time.
Yeah. 20 years for me.
Yeah.
How many for you?
25.
Amazing.
Yeah. It is wild. And I think you and I have had definitely different like environments, right? So you did youth pastoring. Mm-hmm. And then did you always think that women could be pastors or leaders?
Interesting, right? I got radically saved at 16. And so the church I got saved into is the early 2000s. So it's the like mega church where the pastors sit on stage.
Yes.
In their suits. So like I got saved in a wild youth group.
Wouldn't you be on time for church way more time than me? I do think about that. I'm always like, thank you, God. Because I grew up in that church where my dad was a traveling speaker and we had to sit on stage as little girls and watch. Wow. And it's I remember feeling awkward, and here I was just a kid. Had to sit on stage. Oh yeah, I would not be probably in ministry at this point.
Like, you are not fit.
That's right. I'd be giving him Benadryl.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So I think when I first got saved, it was all men in suits, and then there was the women's pastor of the women's ministry. But some of these juicy questions we're going to ask Hav a little bit are the exact things that I probably was subconsciously asking myself. Like, oh, so does that what you have to dress like if you're the woman in ministry? Is that what you have to act like? She actually had like the really, really short haircut. Nothing against that. But it was even then, it just felt like not as like what my type and my style of femininity was. So I was like, oh, maybe you need to do that to fit into that role. So yeah, I was very confused at first. But honestly, then as soon as like my youth pastor always made room, he had me preaching by 17, 18. Wow. So I really didn't question personally. I didn't have that experience. And then every environment I went into in my ministry training years, like every leader was putting me up to preach. Yes. So thankfully I didn't have a lot of walls that I was running into. But what about you?
Well, I'm the same way, but I think I didn't hit the walls until I was no longer teaching youth. See, I think it's safe to teach kids and youth. Yeah, it's like way different. Yeah, it's way different when they put you with people that actually have an opinion about it. Mm-hmm. You know, they kind of let you practice. Mm-hmm. But I never thought much about it. I didn't think I'd be in ministry, and my mom never wanted to do any role in the church like that. So I never was around it. I never had it. In fact, I can remember back. We lived in LA, and Pastor Che On and Sue On were there. And Sue had a very a clear role in the church, but it wasn't that I felt that she was like maybe necessarily leading in that stage. Like there was this kind of co-leader. Really felt like Pastor Che was the pastor. And then going into another church up in Northern California, the pastor's wife was very similar to my mom. You know, just really loved being home, loved her kids, and that's what she did. She did end up being a very strong leader after we kind of left the church. And if people know this podcast and they know where we went, they might say, well, she was, but I wasn't in that world. And then going into church planting, you know, I had no context for women in leadership. Yeah. I just didn't know. I remember first listening to Joyce Meyer.
Yeah.
And that was shocking. And I first thought, I first think like, who is this person? And I honestly thought, is this a man or a woman? Because her voice is very deep. Yeah. And it took me a minute to get used to who she, like what it was, like what the tone was, but then watch her on video and being like, oh, this woman is like a legit communicator. But again, it was so removed when you're watching somebody on a screen and they're in a different place. It doesn't feel like you. And then I had little things like a Marilyn Hickey or some women on on TV, but they were really married to men that were leading. And so it was kind of part of that. So I just had no grid for it.
Wow.
But I had the same thing like you, where I didn't set out to want to be. I ended up fulfilling what was on my life and just couldn't help myself. It was just kind of part of who God had called me to be.
Yeah. So you guys are getting the unscripted, raw conversations, and we get to ask kind of the juicy questions about,
which has taken me a while to talk. I mean,
yes,
to be honest, like for those who are listening and watching, I'm nervous. I'm nervous because I do feel like what I say can come across a certain way or bring confusion or somehow put me on a certain side. And I don't want to diminish those that maybe don't believe fully what I believe and somehow say, well, that's not right, versus like I had to evolve in what I believed. And also just, I do feel like the minority a little bit. So it is a little scary. You know, I'm not leading a church myself, and I'm not married to a man that's leading a church. And so it is a very like, I'm out here. I'm not confused about my call, but it's taken me a long time to have this conversation.
Yeah.
Because I have weightiness to it. I understand the weight of it. I don't understand that the wrong thing said can really affect. Does that make sense?
It's very true. I think it's beautiful. Lisa Bevere always says it. The future is male and female, because obviously the culture has gone so strong. Future is female. And obviously I have a little girl like, yeah, girl power or whatever. But I'm like, no, but we need both. Like he created us both.
We do.
We reign together. Like it's the beauty of the togetherness. But I think that's the question is why, how has it been maybe just such a male leadership dominant in the church world? And then how did you first experience kind of breaking through that?
Yeah, it was interesting. Like I said, when I started out youth ministry, children's ministry, group homes, juvenile hall, I was allowed to go teach in all those places. It was great. I actually think if you do have a heart to teach or preach, those are the perfect places to go and practice the presence of God and what God's doing. And we shouldn't be looking for platforms. We should be looking for people.
Yes.
And so I'm an advocate on that. So that wasn't a lower role,
right?
But it was maybe a less high risk role. And then
they're hungry without the filters.
They are, and they're honest.
Yes.
I always say, like, if you want to really know if God's called you to do it, it's like preaching in front of a crowd. Like it's like a not necessarily like mayhem, but it is. I mean, they don't laugh at your jokes if they're not funny. They don't clap. They don't smile. They are very like, it is what it is. But it causes you to really go, I believe this. So then when I began, I remember the first time preaching as on a Sunday morning at the church that I was at. And I had different people come up to me and said, what do you think about this scripture? Or what do you think about this? Or gosh, I've never seen a woman preach before. That was interesting. I didn't think I'd get anything out of it. And I felt like some of the comments were very revealing. And I remember being taken back because I was already a little insecure about my learning issues. I felt a little like, I had to really, really wrestle. And I've talked about this if you followed me at all. It took me about 10 years to really get free from 17 to 27, like really get free to be me. But then also I found that when I went into leadership, the women that were leading were not like me. And that was challenging too. Either they were married to somebody and so they didn't understand what it was like to kind of be solo, or they were really dominant and felt like this is my place and I deserve to be here. And I'm thinking, well, I don't really feel like that. I don't have that kind of drive. Or I met women that were, only powerful with women, and I thought, gosh, they should be teaching a mixed group.
Yeah. So
I definitely I felt like my opinion of the right or wrong or black and white really got immersed to, and then I would say this, I saw a lot of women who were preaching, but they were really just talking. They were really just sharing. And it really started to bother me because I realized that there were women that were anointed to preach. There were women that were anointed to bring the word. And we were throwing women a bone by saying, here, just get this girl up here to share a story, as if there wasn't women anointed to preach and teach. And so then I started looking for women that were preaching and teaching. And what it did is it actually it convicted me that I was just in my girl, happy mode, making people laugh, telling stories, but that I needed to be a woman of the word and actually lead and feed.
Wow.
So that was a challenging. I've gone through phases. I don't know about you, but that's how I felt.
That's so good. And like such a beautiful way to share the transition that I feel like I just walked on the journey with you. So true. I remember being in so many different church experiences where the only time a woman got on the microphone, it was automatic tears as well.
Yes.
So if it was automatic tears, or one time she's like sharing a story out of, I think, like Vogue magazine or something, like, stop it. You're killing us all right now. Like,
we know.
We are called to preach and teach. And so there were lots of those moments where you're just like, wow. And I remember going to a big youth conference in New York City. We brought our team, and I'm a pastor at that point, but co-pastor, male co-pastor, we're some of our best friends. But he started kind of saying, oh, like, I don't want to go to the next session because it was a female. And I was like, oh, you better. Like, you are being an example to everybody on this team right now. Like, blah, blah. And he ended up saying something that honestly, it helped me. I was like, okay, I see where you're coming from. He's like, it's not that I'm against it. He's like, but he's like, my experience is they try to preach like a man.
Yeah.
Or they're crying. Mm-hmm. And what was beautiful about it, so, we joked, but then also we're like, okay, let's go see. And he had the best experience, and he led like openly with our team about it, of just, she was fully herself. She was feminine, and she was fully herself, led, preached, taught the word. And he was like, that was amazing. So I'm like, it is though. Sometimes you're like, we get a bad rep. We got to work really hard here.
Women will say, I don't want to see women preach. You'll hear women say, I don't like going to girls' things, because it's the same thing. They're saying, just because we're girls, we also don't want to sit and watch somebody practice on us.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say that's, the underbelly of it is that it's not uncommon for me to preach at an event and the men that are preaching not come.
Wow.
And that's very normal. And I used to get hurt and think, well, they should be there. And it really is about keeping my heart pure, knowing what God's called me to do, and realizing that they're limited to understand what a woman can bring into that space, not judging them, but just that.
Yeah, that's so good. I think here's a really good question, actually. Why do we need female leaders in our midst?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. I did some research on this, and even studies have shown that when women are involved, there's more empathy, there's more team building, and there's more equality, meaning that they fight for the underdog. They make sure that people get included. So I think that having women, when I parent my boys, right, my husband and I, the way I talk to my boys is very different than the way that Ben talks to them. And I think you need both. Yeah. We see things differently.
100%. We've always co-pastored together. So my ministry training years before I was married, all the male leaders in my life, which they were all I was led by males. But they always probably just saw that I was anointed and called to do it. So they would always put me up, even before boys, to preach. So that was my frame of reference. Then by the time I got to co-pastoring with my husband, even in youth, I was like, what an outlandish thought. Because I'm seeing these kids from homes that are completely broken homes. So either A, they're actually only raised by a mom. And so then you're like, how is the mother's voice when it comes to everything biblical and, everything in church then silenced? They actually receive super well from the mom voice, and they need that in both worlds. Not just, here's this dude that's actually kind of hard for me because I have father issues, versus, oh, I want to hear from the mom of our house, And Cole totally agreed too. He was like, oh yeah, I'm looking at both the girls and the guys in our youth. They need to hear from you. And so he was always a huge proponent for it. But it's not always like that.
It's not always like that. Have you ever had anyone ever say that they didn't like that you were preaching, or anybody be resistant?
Yeah, there's been resistance. Honestly, my first experience of in my face, how do I exist here, was when I was a young pastor on staff at I was a church of, our staff was 300 or 400, but the pastors was probably 20 of us. And I was the only other female pastor on staff that wasn't the women's ministry pastor. She was the only other woman. And then she was part-time, kind of just did her women's thing. So it was this little compartmentalized. And then I not only was the only other woman, but I was the youngest. And I was fully myself. I am coming in back then. It's kind of embarrassing to think about, but I think I had bright red stilettos. I'm dressing up for work. I'm coming. So I remember being in a pastoral prayer meeting, and it's just all dudes. And I'm excited. It's my first couple of weeks of it. I'm I can't wait to sit in and pray and see what we're how's the church going. And it's sports talk. And I'm And I'm like, I like sports. My husband's a huge sports guy. I like sports. But I'm like, really? So it was just this moment of like, oh, like you kind of imagined, I can't wait to get to this point in my life. And you're like, and then I would always be a comment about my shoes or about something. Yes. And I'm like, can you find something else? Like we could talk about Ephesians. I can go there, but we're talking about my high heels right now.
Initially you feel very out of place.
Yes.
I mean, I'd be in the back room or teaching and and it's noticeable. You know, I would imagine if I was a minority of a different ethnicity, it's noticeable, right? So it's the only way I want to explain it to somebody is like, it's like I'm a different color in a room and it's not that they are not wanting to not having me included or that they don't love me, but my uniqueness is there.
Yeah.
I cannot deny my uniqueness.
Yes.
And so I either can look for my uniqueness to be pointed out and I can take offense, or I can say, I am unique and they don't know how to always react to that. And that's not their fault. It's just that there's nobody else like me in this room. And so I think that's really important. And for me, now that I live with 5 guys, right? So initially I lived in this full female home and then I'd go to these meetings. And even to this day, I was on 3 flights yesterday. And here I am, you know, we are the commuters, the flyers that fly all the time. And it's always me and a bunch of guys. It's always me and 30 guys that are, you know, million milers.
Yeah.
And I just laughed and I said, and I was thinking in my heart, like, you know, God, you knew me that when I was in high school, I used to say, I want 5 boys. I want 5 boys. I said it over and over and over. And now I live with 5 guys. Obviously one is my husband and I said, I'm submitted to him, but and then being in a church world is very masculine. And the truth is it's just a different language. Now, if somebody is putting you down, and you will not put downs, I consistently have someone, and again, I'm on the road, so that'd be wow, my wife really loves you. Or wow, my wife thought that was an amazing message. Or wow, for a girl, you did pretty good. Or wow, you know what? You're the one that turned me. I never thought I would like a woman. And, you know, and that it sounds really like they're complimenting you, but what it does is it's saying you're still different. You still aren't what I expect. And I'm still grading you.
Wow.
And so I really had to learn to take that as it's not their fault. Yeah. It's new and that's okay. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they stayed in the room, they tried to say something kind to believe the best rather than to believe that I deserve. And it's funny, full circle, almost 30 years later, I had gone to a church a couple of years ago, and I was one of the first women to be on their stage. They have a big church, and I was one of the first ones. Didn't know that. Went and preached, and had gone there many different years. But the last time I was there, I spoke on a Sunday, and the first service, the pastor said, "I think that's the best message I've ever heard on that topic." And I'm like in the bathroom smiling, like that is such a win. Like, and again, I want to win for every woman. I know that sounds funny, but like I want to win for every woman because there's girls coming behind me and I want to show them that I can lead, feed without anger, with kindness, with anointing. Like that's in the purest form, right? And then the second service I got done and he goes, "I think that might be the best message you've ever had preached in our church." And I was like, "Can you say that in the mic? Yeah. Can you record that for my children?
Let me replay that."
Yeah, but it was just such a win. Like if I had exited stage left because people didn't recognize or they were kind of rude or even put me down, I wouldn't have that moment 100%. Of saying, I did this. You know, another thing that really surprised me in being a woman in leadership is I thought women would cheer me on. That was shocking to me that women would not cheer me on. I knew how hard it was to get where I was.
Yeah.
And it was so painful because my mom was cheering me on, my sister was cheering me on. But when I would get to places where women were really influential and they were kind of heroes in faith, I found that there were like these 3 kind of narratives.
Oh, wow.
And one of the narratives was, wait your turn.
Yes.
One of the narratives was, don't blow it for the rest of us, right? Don't ruin it for the rest of us. And lastly, don't be better than me. And I didn't know that. So when I got in, I thought, oh, they're going to celebrate. We are the minority. There's just a few of us.
Yeah, we're in this together.
And again, that's not all of them. I've met amazing women that lead, and I don't want to paint that picture, but it was so painful when I realized that it was like high school in some ways. Mm-hmm. And so what I had to really come to grips was, number one, I'm not going to ruin it for you because, you know, I'm going to do my best. And ultimately, God has put us here. Yeah. I'm not going to keep you here and I'm not going to keep myself here. Secondly, wait my turn. I don't know. David fought Goliath. He didn't wait his turn. He did what God called him to do. And God knows what I need to do in my generation, like they need to do it in their generation. So we have girls coming up behind us that are better communicators than we ever were. Yep. They know the word better. And I could either be intimidated or I could be insecure, or I can say they need to be prepared for their generation.
Yes.
And then lastly, I would say, don't be better than me is really their insecurity showing up. And as much as we don't like to think about it, ministry can create, and narcissist is a word that gets thrown around, and I don't really like to use it unless it's clinically diagnosed, but there is a culture in which it does elevate that if you're insecure and you get praised for what you offer, it really does create a healthy ecosystem. And it's not even their fault. It's just not normal to get up on a stage in front of thousands of people and then applaud. Yes. And then every word you say, they're hanging on. And then they're documenting, putting it online, and people are getting you coffee. It's not good for your body. It's not good for your brain. It's not good for your mental health. Yeah. And so without having check and balance, you have to be really careful. I remember for myself coming to a point where I could have somebody do that for me, but I need to do it. It's good for my soul. Good. It's good for me to go, to go get my own coffee, to go clean my own floors. It's just good for me to be, that's not real. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Oh, that's so good.
And so it's very important.
Oh, Havilah, thank you for sharing that. Honestly, I'm just thinking of other women leaders listening, because I remember it actually took me counseling to work through a couple of those. I bumped into the same thing, the wait your turn and the don't do it better than me, the insecurity. It took another older woman saying, that is 100% insecurity in her showing up. It's not you. And I was like, it just freed me so much, because I'm like, there's something wrong with me.
There's something wrong with me.
Yeah.
You do. You get that sense that I'm doing something wrong because
am I in trouble?
Yeah. Or that they are maybe discerning your motive as not being pure, that you're somehow, and it is really, I think it's a challenging thing about leadership is when your heroes are flawed and yet you get a front row seat to it.
Yeah.
And it takes humility to say, I have flaws too. And also, God uses people that are flawed.
Yeah.
Wow. They're flawed. And that's okay.
Yeah.
And I'm not here to clean it up for them. God, the Bible says what's done in secret will be shouted from the rooftop. And you're not that important. God used a mule. Right. It's not like you're the most amazing thing in the face of the earth. Like he used a mule. So you're not that amazing.
It's so true. Keeps us humble for sure. Okay, here's a good question. What do you do to make sure that you're staying true to yourself and not adjusting your behaviors to become more masculine?
Ooh, that's so good. Mm-hmm. So I had this crisis. It was probably about 10 years ago when the Lord told me, I want you to stay as feminine as possible. And I've always been a jeans and t-shirt girl. I have a twin sister. She's really girly. I was always the tomboy. And the Lord actually said to me, I want you to intentionally dress feminine and not try to be one of the bros. And I went, but I want to fit in. I don't want them to feel. And I think when you think femininity, you think sexualization. Like, I don't want them to think that I'm, I don't want them to even think I'm attractive. Like, I want them to think I'm one of the bros. That makes me feel safe.
Yeah.
But there was something about it that I remember having a leader and she was anti all that. And she kind of cheered on that. I wear no makeup. I don't wear heels. I'm just authentic. And I remember the Lord saying to me, being authentic is not about whether you wear makeup or not. It's about who you are. So if you're wearing stilettos and makeup and that's authentically you, you're not covering up. That's who you are.
Yeah.
And so I had to really intentionally, again, some of the masculinity is if you're more masculine, you get included in certain things. That's difficult to talk about. We can't dive too deep into that. Secondly, if you're more masculine, you feel like you're more of a peer.
Yeah.
You're not put in the wife world. But for me, I would say I am very intentional about staying feminine. I watch what I wear. I watch how I say it. And I also think you can use your femininity to be a distraction too. So again, like we talked about, it's not just, are you using your tears to manipulate, using your dress to manipulate, you're using certain things rather than just saying, I'm a girl and that's okay. So for me, I've been intentional. And I think that that's probably kept me out of certain worlds. And I remember even our girls on our staff, and we have a big staff, not Truth Table, but at Bethel. And the girls go, you just are so feminine. I've never seen a girl be that feminine. And my goal is just to give people permission.
Yes.
That's it. So I might swing the pendulum. You never know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll start wearing Jesus t-shirts later. For now. Yeah. We don't want people to think we're confused.
Right.
We're not gender neutral.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, we don't want you to wear heels because you got to look feminine. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm saying that it wouldn't hurt for you to identify in a female way so that there's no confusion. Mm-hmm. And I think that, Joyce Meyer would be that way. She's not super girly, but she does dress nice. You can tell she likes being a girl.
Yeah.
And I think that's the goal is, do you like being a woman?
Yes.
Because if you don't, you're going to put that across in how you dress and how you, it'll show that you don't like being a girl.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say that's
so
important.
Good. That's so good. Okay. Next question. What pressures do you face as a woman in leadership?
I face pressures that men don't. And I have to admit that.
Wow.
So I face pressures as a woman. I face different hormones. I face different stamina, exhaustion. I face giving birth and what that does to your body. What it does to have no sleep for 5 years of your life and getting up multiple times a night. I face those kind of things, right? That the men that I'm around don't face. And I know that we're talking more about in leadership, but there is real limitations as a woman that I have to be okay with, that I am not as clear as, I did give birth. I did, I have limitations. I also would say that I definitely have I think women take the world in. They take everything in, and then they have to edit along the way. Like, I live with 5 guys. It's not personality. I love my boys. I remember when we would go into the mall and there would be like a Victoria's Secret or something inappropriate. All I had to say was, look, an airplane. And all my boys would look up to the ceiling to look for the airplane, and we would miss the store completely. It was like they were like, and it's like how God made them to be very focused, to be one-minded in one thing. And I know we mock men, but it's really a gift that they can get focused. Because listen, if you're their wife, you want to be their focus, right? But so I remembered that. And for girls, we kind of take the whole world in. And so as a woman in leadership, I can have a tendency to be exhausted by taking the whole world in. So I come in and I'm like, oh, that chair isn't fixed. And that woman over there needs this. And these kids here. And so I want to mother the room, which is great, but it's exhausting as a woman in leadership, because I come in and I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to go through this meeting, but I have to do dinner tonight. And then I got to drop this off. And then and we don't compartmentalize as much. And some of us do. Certain women are different ways. But for me, I had to accept that it was harder, that I had to work harder than the average man in the room. And I had to give myself grace, which meant I'm probably going to need more time off. I'm going to need more just grace on myself. And so I'm pretty intentional. And that only came from crashes. That came from ulcers and, depression and anxiety, and all that came from, and I always like to talk about the sacredness of a Monday, but really as a woman in leadership, you going from leader, pastor to mom, men just used to do this, right? Where they would have the commute and they would go to work and then they would do the commute and they would come home. And even in the 1950s, they would give the guy time to like, hey, I have a drink, sit down on the couch, I have a few minutes to onboard.
Right.
For women, I think because of our world, I used to expect myself to go from one room to the next and be able to flip a switch.
Yeah.
And I did not understand the power of onboarding and like on-ramping and off-ramping. And so I found as a woman that I was not able to go to the next box. I actually needed an on-ramp. And so I would sit in my car for a few minutes and close out a few things. Or, I would, I remember like if I would preaching, I would preach a couple services and then I was supposed to go home with the kids. And I would just take my time, maybe go to the bathroom at the church, get my stop by, get a coffee on my way home, just give myself a minute to unwind, because I made more messes when I didn't understand that as a woman, the environments mattered and how I was perceiving it. And I didn't have a wife at home. And I want to say that we're going to talk about this. We have another podcast on this, but Ben is not my wife. Ben is a dude. He's a man. He's got 4 boys at home. when I leave, they eat meat, and they're like, what'd you eat for dinner? We had meat. It's like, they just don't care. Right. But for us personally, he's not at home as a wife. So when I get home, I'm thinking about laundry detergent, and I'm thinking about bills, and I'm thinking about, have we had sex, and, all the things that you're thinking about, and understanding like, okay, but that makes me different, and that's okay. But I better be an expert in how I am, or this world is never going to understand that part of my life. These men are never going to understand that this meeting going late means my dinner doesn't get de-thawed. I can't make the chicken, which is totally, and then they don't get to sports practice. They don't understand the catalyst of that one moment where when they get home, meals waiting for them, or their clothes are in their drawers. And so instead of resenting that, just understanding that I have to have rituals that allow me the grace and the space to enter into the new role. And that's been really important. I don't do it perfectly, but I do try.
This is pure gold, you guys. This is amazing. Thank you for giving us permission to on-ramp and off-ramp. And that's so important. And again, would have saved me years of pain if I could have heard that before. But honestly, as you were sharing and you said, like, I always remembered there's girls coming behind me. Obviously, we're friends now and I know you in real life. But before I knew Havilah in real life, I honestly I remember you saying sometime, probably on your Instagram or something, I'm writing messages while Elmo's on, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm not crazy to be doing that. I think for me, it was Bubble Guppies instead of Elmo. But, I'm like, okay, put the show on, write the message. And so many times of showing up where I'm like, on the worst day where I don't want to, I'm like, I will preach because these girls need to see women, So you've done that to a generation already. And we're thankful, and amazing to think about all the listeners today who might already be even ahead of you, but still learning from your life lessons of your vulnerability and transparency today, of sharing the challenges that we face as women in leadership.
We do. And, I can't think of a better person to have the conversation with, because I think you and I are in that same space, and you're leading in a whole other aspect of pastoring a church and mothering a community even differently than I am. And so, I think the main thing is that we are better together, and we are in it together. And if the only woman in your life is a competitor, then you need to find another woman.
Yes. Yep.
Because that will take you out, because it's already complicated.
You need to find a true godmother.
Yeah. It's already complicated, and you're not making it up. You're not dramatic.
No.
And that's kind of what I want to tell the girls that we're leading today. You're not being dramatic. You're not being suspicious. You're not being critical. You're right. Mm-hmm. It is complicated. You are a forerunner and a pioneer in a season. So don't take it personal. Be kind, be gracious, be a servant. Don't create more havoc. If you feel insecure, go deal with it. Go to counseling. Do the things you need to do, because you are a pioneer. And so this has been an awesome conversation. I love it. I know we're going to have so many more conversations around this, but guys, I want to thank you for being here today at the podcast. And those that are listening, we love you. And those that are watching on YouTube, subscribe. We're going to have a couple more conversations around this topic. If you're a guy and you think, gosh, my wife or my mom or somebody in my world needs this, share it. Please help us get the word out. We need you. And a lot of times we watch things and we forget that we actually are the catalyst to getting this stuff into people's hands. So I'm really glad that you're here, and I hope that this helped. I know it's a complicated conversation, but if nothing else, thanks for being here. We're going to continue this series on women in leadership. So check back in, subscribe to get the notification, and we'll see you next time.